Good evening. My name is Joshua Stuart, class of 2018, and the Associate Director for UVA Clubs and Global Engagement. It is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event with Dean Greg Roberts and Scott Miller. We want to thank you all for joining us, and we hope everyone is safe and well. I want to briefly mention some Zoom reminders. This event is being recorded, and by participating, you grant the University of Virginia the right to use your voice, likeness, in any depiction of these events, including sharing on social media. The Q&A function has been disabled for this presentation, and closed captioning is also available during this program on your bottom bar. I would now like to introduce Dean Greg Roberts and Scott Miller. Dean Greg Roberts joined the university's admissions staff as an associate dean in 2003, and in January of 2009, the university named Greg Roberts Dean of Admissions. Before coming to university, Dean Roberts served as the Associate Director of Admission at Georgetown University from 1999 to 2003. And before Georgetown, he held admissions and financial aid positions at Emory University from 1994 to 1999. Next, Scott Miller. Scott Miller is the Director of Financial Aid. Scott has been with UVA since 2003 and held many titles within the financial department and has probably seen more things than we could possibly imagine. He will undoubtedly be able to answer many and any questions due to his 16 years of experience at the university. Gentlemen.
Well, hello, everybody. I think we're on. I'm waiting to see the, here we go. PowerPoint, a very brief PowerPoint. So I appreciate your patience. First of all, I want to thank all of you for tuning in tonight. I know that we know that an evening program during the school year is can be tough. I think the students have all been in school, probably coming off of practices or club meetings, have homework to do. Parents have had busy days. And so we want to be very conscious of our time. I think if I do my job right and Scott and I do our job right, you'll leave with some important information that I hope is helpful as you begin this process of looking at colleges. My guess is that some of you parents are there with your children, others are by yourselves, but we could be looking at students who are in the 9th grade, thinking about Virginia or thinking about college, and also 12th graders, possibly even transfer students. So with that in mind, I'll keep my remarks fairly general, but I did take a close look at the questions that you submitted earlier in an attempt to really go after some of the big issues and themes that I saw. So if we can move forward here. I want to begin by saying I know some of you come back pretty regularly to Charlottesville and UVA, and others perhaps haven't been back since you graduated. And regardless, I hope that when you do come back, if you haven't been to ground, you get a chance to see the new memorial, the Memorial for Enslaved Laborers. It is a beautiful, peaceful, powerful monument. It honors those who built this university. It's actually located between the corner and the rotunda, but it's a wonderful spot. I see students walking by every day, looking at the inscriptions and the names. I see visitors, picnickers, you name it, but it's a wonderful tribute, long overdue, and we're really proud of this monument that was dedicated just this past summer. And then also, before I go farther, I would like to recognize the Monacan people, the Monacan Nation, whose land the university sits on. You know, I think in a lot of ways we've probably done a poor job in recruiting Native Americans over the years, and I've had some really wonderful conversations over the past 6 months with tribal leaders and the Native American community, and trying to find ways to encourage and recruit students to the university. So with that in mind, let's get started and tackle some of the admission issues. We can go to the next slide if that's okay. I hate to start with numbers. It's probably in poor taste, but some of you who have graduated a number of years ago probably will notice that the university is a little bit larger, a few more schools now perhaps than when you were here, about 18,000 undergraduates. But when you see some of these statistics, these percentages, rankings, it gives you a good idea of how the university is perceived and why it's such a popular place for students. And as a result, we have seen a rather significant increase in applications over the past decade. And I'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. As far as admission statistics, this gives you a sense of what we saw last year. And what I'll try to do over the next few minutes is talk a little bit about philosophically what we're trying to accomplish and offer some practical guidance to the students as they think about applying to college, specifically UVA, but possibly many colleges. But at the same time, there is a lot more than the numbers, and COVID has really impacted how we operate. It's obviously impacted everyone's lives, particularly high school students. And so I noticed in the Q&A, there were quite a few questions about how COVID impacts our review, and maybe possibly some questions about how students can frame their application in light of some of the challenges and struggles and disruptions that you faced over the course of the last 18 months. We've seen a pretty big jump in applications last year. I believe that some of that can be attributed to the fact that the university moved to a test optional admission policy for last year, and ultimately we extended that for 2 more years. So the class of 2022 and 23 will be test optional, and I'll address that in a moment. But because of this policy, I believe that some students who might in other years opted out, perhaps decided not to apply because they thought their testing was not strong enough to give them a reasonable chance to admission through the applications in last year because they thought they had a better chance. And then secondly, I think because students were unable to visit colleges around the country and sometimes eliminate schools because of those visits, they cast a broader net and threw in more applications. My guess would be, and so you see the offer rates are incredibly low for compared to what we saw just a few years ago. My guess would be that this year the application volume would decline. I think it'll drift down. It'll still be competitive, but I can't imagine a scenario where we would see this many applications again in 2022. Next. As far as the timeline, you can see it here. What I'd like to address in this slide is the questions that I heard about early decision and early action. You can note the timeline here. The one small change is that we moved our regular decision deadline to January 3rd. We are hearing from counselors that if you have a deadline on the 1st, which is a traditional date, and that date lands on a weekend, it creates unnecessary stress with students and families. And so we moved it to a Monday. We do have 3 admission plans at UVA, and this is a very good question to ask all of the schools that you're considering, but an early decision plan is a binding program, as you might know. And what that means is that UVA is your first choice, and you know it without a shadow of a doubt. And you are prepared to submit an application on November 1, and then we would render a decision by probably mid-December. This pool generally is pretty small. Of the 48,000 applications last year, about 2,500 were early decision. In comparison, early action, which is also a November 1 date, that pool was, if memory serves, something like 25,000, so much, much larger. It's logical, though, if you think about it, because early decision as a binding program really requires a pretty significant commitment on the part of the student. So they have to know, and they do not have the ability to talk, to compare financial aid offers in the spring, the way you might with early action and regular decision. And Scott in a moment is going to talk a bit about the financial aid policy. Regular decision, January 3rd, we would notify you typically in late March. One of the questions I received was, is it easier or are you at an advantage to apply early decision? I think that's probably the case at most schools. I wouldn't say it's necessarily the case at UVA. It's going to depend upon the year and the applicant pool, but by and large, it might offer some advantage because we're unaware of the applications that are to come. So we're making early decisions sort of in a vacuum. We do admit students, we defer students, and we deny students during the early decision pool. I would not apply early decision if it's not your first choice because you think you have a better chance of being admitted, because then you might make a wrong choice that you regret later if you find that you're unhappy at the school you choose to attend. And we can get more into that in the Q&A, I think. Why don't we move to the next slide for sake of time? So as far as the application to Virginia, you see the schools on the left, which are the first year schools. Those are the divisions that we would make decisions on in our first year applicant pool. Some of the upper division schools on the right, in other words, schools you would enter in perhaps your second, third year, are schools that do offer transfer, external transfer options. But the first year options for those that are in high school, you'll see them to the left. And you would make a decision on your application as to which of these programs you want to apply to. You would only apply to one. You're only considered to one. Most of the applicants apply to the College of Arts and Sciences. It's our biggest division, probably the greatest degree of flexibility in the academic curriculum. The engineering school would be the second largest with about 600 entering first year students. By comparison, architecture has about 90 slots, nursing 75, and kinesiology 50. So you might think that those schools are harder to get into because they're smaller, but in most cases, the application volume is proportional to the size of the school and to the slot. So you're not at an advantage or a disadvantage necessarily, depending upon the school that you apply to. We do look at them a little bit differently, but we can talk more about that perhaps in a moment. Next slide. As far as the high school profile and transcript, one of the things that you hear about in a process like this is it's not a formula. It's not an equation. We call it holistic reading. It might be a dated concept or dated term, but the point is that we're looking at everything you submit, and we're looking at it very carefully. This is not a perfect process by any stretch. It is a very thoughtful and personal and thorough process, I would say. We have human beings reading your application. Most often, an applicant is read multiple times, at least twice, often 6 or 8 times. So we take a lot of care in trying to get to know you as a student, and that's where the transcript will come in, possibly your test scores. But we're also very, very interested in getting to know you as a human being. We want to hear what you enjoy, what your challenges are, what type of, we're trying to predict in some sense what type of contribution you would make to UVA, and in turn, what we can do to help you grow and learn as a student, as a scholar, but also as a human being. So if we can go through a couple of these bullets, the transcripts are all going to be specific to your high school. So, often I'll hear about students who want to, gauge their odds of admission based on a posted average GPA that a college will talk about. GPAs, grade point averages, mean very different things at different schools. So if you think about your school, for the students out there, your grading scale might be 90 to 100 as an A, whereas a school down the street, it could be 94 to 100. So the A's mean something a little bit different. At some institutions, some high schools, there's a lot of grade inflation. At some places, they give you a lot of weight to your GPA, to your grades, based on whether or not you took an advanced course or an honors course or an IB or an AP course. And so what we're trying to do merely is we're looking at your transcript within the context of your high school. We're looking to see that you've challenged yourselves with rigorous courses in areas where you feel you're strong. And then we're looking to see that you performed well in those courses. And that gives us probably the best indicator of college success is that 4-year experience in the high school. I would say the transcript is the anchor to your entire application. It's not your whole application. There's a lot more to it, but it is probably the most important part. Well, I would say without a doubt, it is the most important part of your application. Next. As far as recommendations and essays, these are really my favorite parts of the application. If you think about the numbers that are associated with grade point averages and test scores, they can give us some sense of who you are academically. They give us very little about who you are as a human being. And so we like to hear from people who know you, and we like to hear from you. And so we offer you the opportunity to submit recommendations from teachers and from guidance counselors. Sometimes other people want to submit something if they feel strongly, or perhaps you want to send an extra recommendation. That's perfectly acceptable. But I would keep this in mind. You don't want to overdo it with additional recommendations. In fact, I would say 90% of the applications just send two: a teacher rec and a counselor recommendation. Occasionally, there's someone that can add a different slant to who you are. Say you're an artist and you have someone from the art community that wants to talk about how you approach your art, or say it's an employer, you worked at a coffee shop over the summer, and they can talk about your work ethic and how you treated customers. That can be powerful and interesting, but don't feel as if you need to do that. I do think some students send too many, and then it really dilutes everything that we have in the other recommendations. As far as the essays, we offer you the opportunity to submit several essays. One is a long Common App essay, and the others are more specific and have some UVA specific prompts. This tells us about how you think, how you approach problems, how you write. We can go on and on about essays. I think it's probably one of the more stressful parts of the application process. Some students love it because they love to write. Other students worry that they're not going to be able to demonstrate what they want us to see. To me, it's often less the topic and more how you approach the topic. It's most 17-year-olds have not had life-altering experiences, for good and for bad. If you have, certainly feel free to talk a little bit about these struggles or these opportunities and challenges. But if you don't need to. One of the best essays I ever read was about a student who wrote about a single at bat in a baseball game. He was not a star player. He didn't play much, in fact. This was not a state championship team. It was a mediocre team in a mediocre year. But he described going to the plate at a critical moment in a ball game when he rarely played. And he described his emotions. He described the dirt and sweat in his batting gloves. He described the smell of the cut grass. He told me a little bit about how he used to play with his grandfather before his grandfather passed away. And in the end, I don't remember if he got a hit or if he struck out. That wasn't the point. But I remember him, and I remember I liked him, and I remember he had a lot of heart and soul. And I could see him at a place like UVA. He was a thoughtful, sweet, earnest kid. And I felt like that he would really do well here. And it made a difference. And so when you think about your essays, keep that in mind. It does not have to be this world-changing topic. It just needs to be personal to you. And as far as activities, I realized that with COVID, a lot of activities stopped for a period of time, and they still might not be fully operational. When you fill out the application, feel free to put in what you've been involved with. There is a question in the common application essay about COVID, and it allows you to share some information about how COVID has impacted you or your family or your life or your opportunities. For us, activities really run the gamut. It's simply, what do you like to do outside of the classroom? There are school-sponsored activities, there's student government and band and debate and sports, clubs. There's also part-time jobs. There are internships. There are opportunities to work in the community, to volunteer. Sometimes students are just taking care, particularly in COVID, single parent families where the mom is working and the dad lives in another city, and you have 3 younger siblings. You couldn't possibly be involved with as many things as you normally would be, because every day you are coming home and taking care of your little brothers and sisters. So that's a type of information that's important for us to know. But for us, we just want to see that you're active, engaged, you like to do things, you're not just all academics. And we're looking a little bit at leadership opportunities and commitment, things of these sorts over time. But don't feel like you have to invent things and make things up. It's really just an opportunity to hear about what you enjoy. And I think this might be the funner, more enjoyable part of the application to complete, actually. Thanks. And lastly, the test optional policy, we get a lot of questions about this. In fact, I bet the vast majority, 25% of the questions that were submitted were about testing. If you had asked this question several years ago before COVID, I would probably have a different answer. I think most schools that were test optional saw students that submitted testing by and large. And usually when you see the word optional in a college application, it's something you should do. So for example, if you have an optional interview at a school, I would take advantage of that. But in this case, optional is a little bit different. A, because not everyone to this day is able to take an exam in a safe environment, and we understand that. And B, we've learned to read without the testing. I think testing plays a role. It can give us an insight into a student that we lack without it, but it's a blunt instrument. It is highly correlated to family income, to background. And so if you evaluate a file or a test score with that in mind, it helps with context. The question of whether or not to submit or not, it really depends on you. I wish I could give you a specific answer. My only advice would be to look at the average test scores of a college that you're applying to. And if you fall in that middle range, you're probably going to submit them. If you fall below the middle range, you might not. And if you're up the top end, it's going to look good and you will submit it. About 60% of our students last year submitted testing. And I would say about 70% of the offers were students that submitted testing. That wasn't by design. I wouldn't read too much into that. It was our first year. We were trying to understand the pool. That doesn't suggest, for example, that we prefer testing over those that do not submit testing. But if you feel that the standardized test scores that you have do not accurately reflect who you are as an academic, as a student, they weren't as strong as you would have liked, then don't take them, don't submit them. They're not nearly as important as you think they are. Okay, so that I wish I could be more specific. We don't have a lot of time, and I want to be respectful and have Scott speak. But if you have any questions that I don't answer after the Q&A, I'd urge you to call us. We're so appreciative of our alumni. You do so much for the university, so much for us in recruiting students. The last thing I'll say is we did a survey. We surveyed all of the admitted students this past year, and we asked them who influenced their decision to apply to Virginia and to enroll. And as much as we would have liked for them to say the admission officers, we're pretty sure they wouldn't, and they didn't. They said that it was the top two were UVA students and UVA alumni. And so either directly or indirectly, your conversations, parents and students with prospective students matters. Your joy, your pride in this place, your enthusiasm, your spirit is unlike you find at most schools. And I couldn't be more thankful and grateful for all you do for us. And we want to help you through this difficult process. So if there are questions that we cannot get to, please call the office. And even if you want to ask for me, if I am in, I will certainly be happy to talk to you by phone or Zoom or answer or help in any way. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. There's some social media sites. We'll go through those, and I'm going to hand it over to Scott so we can move forward with financial aid and leave some time for some Q&A. But thank you very, very much for having me. It really means a lot to me.
Thank you, Greg. So I'm Scott Miller. I'm Director of Financial Aid. I want to talk to you a little bit about what it takes to apply for financial aid at the University of Virginia. Our starting point there is the cost of attendance, and you can see the information for tuition fees, etc., housing, dining, personal. It does not list on here travel to get to the university, and but we do include that as well, and the cost of attendance. And the reason we start here, and this is our starting point for financial aid, is because we meet 100% of demonstrated need. And so we're going to ask families that apply for need-based aid through Student Financial Services to complete the free application for federal student aid, the FAFSA form, and then also the CSS profile. And this is both for custodial families and the non-custodial families in those divorced and separated situations. And through those applications, we'll make a determination of an expected family contribution, which we'll subtract from the cost of attendance. And the remainder is financial need. And then we'll use a combination of loans, work study, and grant aid from all sources to be able to meet need. We do have a cost estimator available there. If you use the My Intuition cost calculator, it asks you about 5 simple questions, and based on that, it can give you a high, low, and best estimate of your need-based eligibility. So I would encourage you to use that calculator just to determine if you would be eligible for need-based aid at the university. I also strongly encourage you to go to our website, sfs.virginia.edu, and follow the apply for aid for new students, for first-year students. We have instructions in English and in Spanish and also simplified Chinese to kind of give you the direction for what we need for financial aid applications and for us to do an assessment of need. So when you're filling out the applications this year, you're going to use your 2020 federal 1040 forms, so the financial information off of those forms. And we know that 2020 was a tough year for a lot of people. And we know that since COVID kind of hit for most people, did for us here around March of 2020. And we know some people lost jobs or had reduced income during that time period. And so your 2020 taxes should be indicative of what your situation was at that time. But if you're still in a situation of unemployment or reduced income, we do have an appeal process that we will work with our entering students, and we can substitute the 2021 tax information, or we can do an estimate for 2022 if those amounts of income would be lower in your situation. So we're here to help work with you in filling out those applications and helping you to determine what type of aid award. And so our goal is to try to get you a preliminary financial aid award. And so if you apply early decision, it will go out a few days after you get your admission decision. And then likewise for early action and for regular decision. And then you'll have the financial information that you need in order to make a decision about your admission to the university and whether this is the place for you. But again, I would encourage you to go to our website, sfs.virginia.edu, and read about apply for financial aid. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Greg and Scott, for both of those aspects of the admissions process. We're now going to move into a little bit of Q&A, so I will invite you all back. There were over 200 pre-submitted questions from you all, so we hope to answer some of them, but not all of them. So Greg, I will start with you. We had a lot of questions about legacy. So this is a two-fold question. Can you explain if legacy still matters or what impact it has on the application? But then also what qualifies as legacy, a sibling, aunt, uncle, etc.
Great, thanks, Josh. Absolutely, and yes, absolutely. Legacy is and always has been important to us and to UVA. Let me start with the second part first. And a legacy at Virginia is an applicant whose parents graduated from university, undergrad or graduate. It does not include aunts and uncles, grandparents, or siblings. Not that we don't always see that or notice it, but it is really technically children of UVA graduates. And so, I think there was some confusion about this. This was probably 6 or 7 years ago now, to be honest. And I think part of this is our fault. We used to describe the impact as if, we used to say that out-of-state students were considered like in-state. And I think that was taken literally in a way. And the reason we shared that is because at the time, the offer rates For out of state, we're somewhat in line with the in-state. So that was sort of the easiest, quickest way to describe it. But it wasn't actually what happened. It wasn't as if the out of state students were then moved into the in-state pile. I would say that the legacy applicants, by and large, as a group, are stronger than the non-legacies, which to some degree is reflected in the elevated offer rate. But with that said, we're still, it's still competitive. We're still looking at the same thing. We're having the same conversations. In a closed case, that's the type of thing that could tip a student forward, for example. And that's really probably the best way to put it, although perhaps less helpful because it's not as specific as some would hope, but that's probably the best way I can describe it.
Thank you. And then one question concerns quotas. So are there any in-state quotas versus out-of-state versus international with the admissions process?
Sure, yeah, it's a great question. I think that in our world, and my job security is based on how close I can hit certain targets. I wouldn't say a quota, and let me sort of explain. Every year, we have a target, a class target, say for first year, and this year, and most year, well, I think this coming up year, it's going to be roughly, 3,900 students. And then we have individual targets within those schools that I showed you, 50 physiology students, 75 architects, and so forth. But then we don't have a quota, but we've always operated with, sort of a loose agreement with the state that we would enroll about 2/3 of our students from the Commonwealth of Virginia. So that's what we shoot for every year. Our offers are impacted by that, the number of offers we make. We have an algorithm that gives us some sense of how many offers will yield us 1/3 of the students from outside of Virginia and 2/3 from in-state. Normally it ends up at about 70-30 when you count the transfers in. As far as internationals, they count towards the out-of-state target. So I would say it's usually about 28% of our students are domestic out-of-state students. 5% are international out-of-state students, and then 67% would be Virginians. There are no quotas or targets or for county in Virginia or high school. We don't have a cap on the number of students we can admit from a high school. We're completely unaware of how many offers we've made by county. We're making student decisions one at a time, sometimes together with the school, but often, randomly assigned, so that we're really focusing on a student, not a school group at the outset. So hopefully that helps you some. It's probably easier for me to think of than to describe, but the only real targets we have are residency and targets by individual school, and then an overall target, if that makes sense.
Fantastic, thank you. And then a couple of questions concerning types of review or evaluations based on international applicants and homeschooled applicants. How are they evaluated, as well as student athletes? I know that's 3 very different groups, but how are those evaluated in comparison to a regular student?
Sure. Well, that's a great question. And let me begin by saying that our process and the way we review and the way we train our readers is the same for all of those. Okay, we're having the same conversations with ourselves or with our colleagues or with our committees, regardless of whether or not a student is an in-state or an out-of-state student or a homeschooled student or an international student or an athlete. They all fill out the application, they all complete it, they all do it by the deadline. Homeschool students are a little bit different because they come in a lot of shapes and sizes. In other words, some homeschool students are fully enrolled in a community college. Others are taking some school courses at their high school, but other courses are being taught by, a retired faculty member. Others are taught by their parents in the basement. So the more information that you can provide about the academic program, what is being taken, what's the curriculum look like, these sorts of things would help us. For international students, we have an international team because those transcripts can look quite different from a domestic transcript. Sometimes they don't even have grades. Sometimes, in the UK, for example, they have, predicted A levels, which are tests at the very end, and then they have A-level tests. So it requires some expertise. And so we have some deans and counselors in the office that are expert in the international review. And then the athletes are all through the normal, they are assigned to regional teams. In fact, our teams don't even know their athletes when they're reading them. With that said, at some point in the process, we will get a list of the committed athletes who we've already pre-reviewed, and we'll go back and take a second look at those. And often, students who we've committed to and have committed to the university, we would, offer to those students. We would never offer to a student who we don't believe is going to be successful here and graduate. So there are some athletes, in fact, quite a few, more than people would assume, that would be admitted without their athletic commitment. But others, because of that talent, would be elevated. But we do the same thing to some degree, maybe to a lesser extent, with musicians and folks that excel in theater and in other areas as well.
Thank you. And then Scott, I'll ask you one of the questions that we have. So what are things to look out for when you're completing your financial aid application?
Well, we do encourage parents and students to be very patient when they're filling out their applications, and just concentrate on some of the things that sometimes seem obvious, because like with the FAFSA form, we do have to match it up with a Department of Education database. And so it does require a student's social security number, date of birth, last name, same for the parents. And sometimes we see parents, they may be working on not only their entering students FAFSA, but they may be doing the siblings application as well. Sometimes we get the wrong date of birth, the wrong social security number, and some of those kind of things can cause delays in the application because things aren't matching up with what we have maybe on file at the university. And so we do have a list of common mistakes on our website, and parents and students should take a look at that and just make sure that they try to avoid some of those. And again, just be very careful as they're answering the questions.
Great, thank you. And then one more, Scott.
Sure.
Can you talk about the financial aid opportunities after your first year on grounds?
Sure.
What does that process look like?
So we do require students to apply each year because financial situations or the makeup of their households can change from year to year. And so that is evaluating students for their eligibility for need-based aid at the university. But as students move through the university and they get involved in their major and in their school, there are opportunities for scholarships outside of SFS through those schools and departments. And the different schools do things different ways. And so we encourage students to look at the individual school websites and for the financial opportunities there. For a lot of schools, it usually ends up being scholarships that they would apply to at the end of their second year because they're scholarships for their third and fourth year. They may be an English major or political science or something along those lines where they have an endowed scholarship. And then there's also opportunities through the Alumni Association and other areas like that. We have them all listed on our website. If you go to sfs.virginia.edu, just do a search on scholarships, and we put together a page that provides some detailed information for parents and students.
Something to add on to that, Greg? Thank you, Scott.
No, I was just
Perfect.
because I pretend to keep myself muted.
Well, we're coming to you with the next question. Do admissions departments limit the number of applicants they will accept for high school?
I'm sorry, say that again, sir.
So is there a limit on applicants that they will accept at a high school? You sort of touched on that, saying that there's not really a quota, but is there particularly one if you're accepting a lot of students from a particular high school?
No, there's not. Now, given the offer rates, it would be highly unlikely for every student from an applicant to high school to be admitted, but it's been done. Maybe a smaller school that has 5 applicants or something, but when you see some of the public schools in the state with, sometimes we have several hundred applications, in a lot of ways, the offer rate does come reasonably close to the overall Virginia offer rate, but that's not any sort of goal of ours.
Great. And then we have an interesting question. So due to COVID, how does UVA view online high school programs compared to the traditional high school program?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what, when folks say, I think everyone was online most of last year. Not everyone. Some private schools were fortunate enough to be in session. Most of the public schools were out at least until spring, and then maybe it was a hybrid. So the fact of the matter is most schools were online. If you're referring to sort of a separate online school, we would look to see that that's accredited. We need to find out a little bit more about the school like we would anywhere. I don't see very many students that are applying from an online high school, even in COVID, although it could be different this year for all I know. But, the one thing that it reminds me of, though, Joshua, is that, another part of the process that's really, pretty dramatically impacting applications is those recommendations. My son is also a senior in high school. Scott's daughter is also a senior in high school. They're in the same high school, Charlottesville High School. But my son was out of, did not go to school from March of 2020 until this fall. And so all of his junior year classes where he would get his recommendations were online. And so, it makes it hard because he doesn't know his teacher as well. And so we're aware of these nuances to the application, just like it impacts, your extracurricular opportunities. It impacts and your application, some schools went to pass fail, for the end of the second semester of, their junior year, 2020. We understand all of that. We see a lot of different things, and it's the school's responsibility to tell us a little bit about what they did. And I have to assure you that they do a very, very good job of informing us of how they adjusted during COVID. But it did remind me that those recommendations, can be a little bit tough for kids who have been online for such a long period of time. I get that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And then we have a question about sort of the Eccles Scholar, Jeff Scholar. How do you be considered for those? And sort of what are those processes like?
Right. So a little bit different. The Eccles Scholarship, for those that don't know or remember, is sort of the honors program within the College of Arts and Sciences. Likewise, we have a college science scholar for the budding researchers out there in the college, smaller program. And then we have the Rodman Scholars, which is the honors program within the E-School, engineering school. And we make those decisions within the admission office. They come out at one point in time, which is in the spring. So in some years, when we started with early decision and early action, we used to do them in waves. But now, given the volume, we just wait to make all of those decisions in the spring after we've read all the applications. These are generally the tip top of the pool, probably the top 5 or 10% of the entire applicant pool. So these are really students that are, accomplished academically, have tremendous potential. These are also students who demonstrate a love of learning. But those are not scholarships in the financial sense, but those are programs that have some bells and whistles that can be pretty attractive to the top students. And finally, you can actually apply to those programs, particularly the Eccles programs, after you're already enrolled. So, they admit some students going into the second year. The Jefferson Scholarship is much different. That's a run through the Jefferson Scholars Foundation, which is not technically UVA, it's a foundation. And they have a series of interviews that take place, regional interviews. They culminate in some about 100 students, 120 students selected as finalists. And those finalists would have will normally be an in-person weekend with the Jefferson Scholars Organization Foundation, and generally 30 or 35 students are selected for full ride 4-year scholarships. But that's not something that the admission office handles. You normally need to be nominated by your high school.
Perfect, thank you. And then we're going to turn to sort of more transcript and course heavy questions. So the decision not to take an AP, how does that affect a transcript when viewing upon it? If you see a student that's succeeding, oh, excuse me, they did not take the exam for their AP. How does that affect sort of the outlook on the transcript?
Thanks, Joshua. That's a good question. Let me hit that from both angles. Your first one, which wasn't your intention, but it's a good question, and the second as well. We go back to rigor, and rigor, it depends upon your school. Some schools offer a full menu of AP courses, 25 or more. Other schools offer a handful. Some schools give students free reign to take as many as they want whenever they want to. Other schools limit it. So they say students are able to take 1 AP in the 10th grade, 3 in 11th, and 4 in 12th or something. So, and that's another way, an example of how context matters. If we just went through and counted up the AP courses, it would be incredibly unfair because some schools do not even have AP courses and some limit the numbers that students can take. And the bigger point though is how many to take. And, that's hard to answer, I think. I would just say that what you don't want to do is protect your grade point average or your grades by taking a lighter load than you're capable of. We do want to see that you've challenged yourselves academically, and the rigor of the courses and the grades are have the highest correlation to performance at UVA. So for example, if you're a student who's made A's in math your first 3 years and you've gotten to pre-calculus in your junior year, and you have the opportunity to take calculus, which is often the highest level math course, I take it. Because you're a good math student, you can handle that. I wouldn't take something lighter to protect because you're worried about getting a B in math. With that said, if you're someone who takes foreign language because it's expected, you get up to a certain level, but foreign language is just not your thing, you don't enjoy it, and you get up to Latin 4 in your junior year because you took some in middle school, you don't have to take AP in every discipline. But if you're a strong student, you want to try to challenge yourself. It is possible to overdo it. You can overextend and take too many high-level courses, and then your grades reflect it. So, you make all B's because you took too many AP courses. So it's a bit of a balance. I think yourself, how you study, how you handle stress. Your counselor knows you. Your counselor can have a conversation with you about what types of schools you're applying to. I am a little bit worried about the race to take as many advanced courses as possible. And I fear sometimes that we're complicit in that because it's so selective. I have to say I read far more essays and statements and recommendations about students who are depressed or struggling with anxiety than I ever have. I mean, it's stunning. And it worries me and it concerns us here. And, we're having some very serious conversations about this and how we can help students, not only when they're here, but develop an admission system, not only at UVA, but nationally, that's a little bit more humane. Because, your health and well-being, physical health, mental health is far more important than, this getting into the most prestigious school you can get into. I know that's easier said than done, but you've got to take care of yourself. And if you're going to be overwhelmed and stressed and depressed and have no time for anything else, you can't sleep because of your workload, and you're taking too much. And the scores, I like to see the AP scores. If you took some AP courses in, 9th, 10th, and 11th, or any combination, it's natural that you'd see the scores, right? If you don't do well, you make a 2 or a 1, I wouldn't submit them. You probably aren't going to submit them, but we're not going to sit here and question it thinking that that since you didn't submit, that means as a result, you had a 1 or 2. Particularly in a year like this, it was hard to take AP exams. Some of them were online, the year before last or even last year. So that's all part of this COVID-related adjustment that we're trying to make.
Fantastic, thank you. We have a couple questions about the transfer student experience. So is there a number on how many transfer students are accepted each year? And then what does that situation look like in terms of sort of that evaluation process? And then Scott, if you wanted to chime in on the financial aid part for transfer students as well, I think both of those would be great.
Yeah, thank you. And it reminds me of something else I'll add to it that's somewhat new. We do have a transfer target, just like we have a first-year target. The transfers tend to be a much higher percentage of Virginians. Some are coming in after 1 year at another school, and some are coming in after 2. About half the transfers at the moment are community college students. There's 46 different branches of the Virginia community college system in the state. They are often very, very good schools, and we are eager to admit students because they're public institutions and there's a strong relationship there. But there are about 600 and some odd transfer spots in the fall for the fall term, March deadline for application. And then we usually have 30 or 40 mid-year transfers that come in after 1 year. You cannot come in after 1 semester. You have to be, the earliest you can come in is 1 year after you graduate from high school. But if a student does not get admitted and can't get UVA out of their mind, transfer is a very good route. The offer rates are probably a little bit higher. The pool isn't quite as deep. The other thing that is worth mentioning, so you can spend 3 years at UVA instead of 4. I know that's not an easy conversation to have once you receive a decision that disappoints you with first year, but it's certainly an underutilized way to come to UVA. We also allow Virginians who were waitlisted and did not emerge off of the wait list, were not offered off of the wait list, to go to UVA Wise for a year. UVA Wise is down in Southwest Virginia, about 5 hours. But you go there as part of a special program, and then you would guarantee, provided you make a 3.0 and in the right courses, you would come back and start at UVA automatically as a second-year student. So it's almost like you're studying abroad for a year and twisted away. We had probably 30 kids last year, somewhere around 25, 30 kids that opted for that route and started this fall. So that's another new pathway to UVA in Charlottesville. Scott, I don't know if you had anything to add with transfer.
Sure. We also meet 100% of need for all eligible transfer students, and same requirements. We need a FAFSA, and we also need the CSS profile. I think that's probably the biggest thing that we see. A lot of the community colleges, or I would think most of the community colleges, only require the FAFSA form. And but for our institutional aid, institutional grant aid, we need to see the CSS profile. The deadline's a little bit later, so they have until April 1st to be able to submit that information to us. But it allows us time to be able to review the applications so that we can get information to you shortly after your admission decision comes out. It gives you time to be able to evaluate your aid if that's part of your evaluation process to decide whether you're going to attend or not.
Thank you both. As a transfer student, it was an easy process. I enjoyed it, and look where I am now. So definitely works, and it was a great decision. Greg, I have 2 more questions. One being, what factors are there to consider when applying to the college as opposed to one of the first-year divisions you mentioned earlier?
Sure. Most students apply to the college. I think most students when they're 17 aren't really sold on a career path yet, or if they do, they think of, one of a handful of careers, business, pre-med, law, those sorts of things. And then they come to the college and they're just, their eyes are wide open. They're exposed to so many different fields and professions and, really inspiring faculty members. And so I would say most students are going to go in that direction. I think that's the flexibility within that program, and the number of majors and options is almost limitless. It seems like it's limitless. With that said, the other schools tend to be a little bit more narrowly focused, but also have some flexibility too. So, if you're an architecture student or a nurse or an engineer, you're still going to take some classes in the College of Arts and Sciences, but you're going to start within this school that will ultimately result in a degree in engineering or architecture. The one that's gotten to be interesting to me is architecture, because that's a program that, out of all of them, it's probably got a higher offer rate because we see fewer applicants. I think people aren't really quite sure in high school what architects do. But it could probably stand to be renamed, and for the architecture alums out there, you're probably going to be mad, but renamed in the sense that it really is a program for people that are creative, that like design thinking and like to build. And so in a lot of ways, I think that might broaden the appeal to that program. But nonetheless, you're entering a more narrowly tailored field, whereas the college, you're taking courses across a vast array of disciplines. In engineering and these other schools, you're taking some of those as electives, but most of your courses are sequential in some cases and moving towards that ultimate goal. So as far as admission, we might look at engineers a little bit differently in the sense that we'd like to see physics, we'd like to see calculus. For nurses, we'd like to see that students understand what a nurse does, and so might have, people who have spent some time in a healthcare profession as an intern or shadowed a doctor or a nurse, or was it like a candy striper or whatever they call those now, those sorts of things, just so we know that what you're getting into. So expectations are the same, but we might look at them slightly differently depending upon the program.
Fantastic. And then how can alumni sort of support you all in the admissions process and with prospective UVA students? You mentioned it a little bit, but feel free to reiterate.
Yeah, and you guys do, and I can't thank you enough. I feel like we sort of underutilized alums, and we're looking at that right now, given the fact that you're so impactful in the decisions. I mean, some of what you do is just what you do on a daily basis. You're having a conversation with a friend whose kid is looking at UVA, and you can reflect on your experiences or connect them to someone here. I think other ways our students will hear from our alums once they're admitted. So if you're from Dallas and you're able to call students from Dallas and congratulate them on their admission, and then just little touch, that little thoughtful, kind, considerate welcome can really go a long ways, and particularly now when students are doing so much virtually, they don't really have the chance to visit as much. I think people like kindness, and they like coming to a place where they feel people will care for them. And lastly, I'll say that, as I started with, the level of pride and spirit that our alums have is second to none. And how could you not want to come here after talking to one of our alums, to be honest with you? So, I just want to thank you first and foremost. And if there's anything that I could do or we could do to help you, that's really what we want to do. We value you, we appreciate you. And I think we can probably do better at showing you that. And I'm working on that myself now as I think about how we engage with you through this process.
I would say, I was just going to say, I would wanted to pop in there, Josh, and just tell the ones who are UVA alums to be able to be on the lookout for those students who would be a good fit at UVA. And sometimes they look at the cost and they kind of self-select out because they just don't think they can afford it. But we awarded well over $100 million in grant aid this past year. And so we do meet 100% of need for those eligible students. And so we really want to give that money away to those students that have the ability to be a student at UVA and but may think that they can't afford it. And please give us a chance, fill out the application, apply for admission, and come and be a part of UVA.
Love that. Thank you, Scott, for adding that in, because that is super important. But thank you both for tonight's discussion, and thank you all for those who watched at home. We hope this program provided some insight on how to move forward with the admissions process and learning more about the financial aid as well. If you have any more questions, feel free to visit the sfs.virginia.edu as well as admission.virginia.edu. And be sure to visit alumni.virginia.edu for more virtual programming. And have a great night and go Hoos.